Hello, good evening, Prof. Akihisa and Bu Ayu.
Halo Pak Asep, Pak Aki, meet
Yep.
Pak Asep, Dr. Asep Kamaludin is our Vice Dean. So unfortunately, the Dean is still on the university's meeting now for
Yeah.
some urgent matters. So Pak Asep will be kindly opens our event today.
Yeah. Hello, Prof. Akihisa. Greetings from the Dean. He couldn't attend because there was many meeting in faculty, in university.
Thank you very much. Yes, I understand there are many meetings for Dean and Vice Dean.
Oh, by the way, Prof. Aki is also a Dean, right? So he knows.
Yeah, I finished. Yes, I finished.
Oh, you finished.
Last year I finished, and then I'm
I
now
finished
rather
already,
free. Yeah, after half year sabbatical, I'm now a little bit free.
How many years did in the Japan? How many years in one period?
You mean deanship?
Yeah.
2 years.
Oh, 2 years.
Very short.
Oh,
But before that, you become a vice dean, and you serve, well, the vice dean for 4 years. So in total, you serve the executive board of the faculty for 6 years in total.
Yes.
That's very long.
Yeah, that's long. So now you're ready to finish your book, right?
I see.
Yeah, I have to.
Our book, Pak, it's been delayed for 1 year now.
Which? Oh yeah, your book.
Our book.
Our books,
Our book.
our book, all lecture.
Oh. All right. So Pak Aki and Pak Asep, perhaps we can start.
Yep.
I think already a lot of people here in the room.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should welcome everyone for today's meeting. So shall I just open and then shall we just start? All right. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great day today. I'd like to welcome you all for our. Actually, this is the first event organized by our center. Our center is called. This is a newly established center called the Center for Citizenship and Human Rights Studies in Faculty of Social and Political Science at Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. We are located in Jakarta. I saw many of you are coming from various countries, and I'm really happy and very delighted to welcome you all for today's meeting. My name is Ayu, or Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum, Ayu Wahyuningrum. Just call me Ayu. I will be your moderator for today's discussion, and I'm currently the head, the director of the center, but also teach political science at the university. And yeah, I'm very happy and very pleased to lead to moderate the session today. I will let I'd like to invite our Vice Dean, Dr. Asep Kamaludin, to formally open and give some remarks, opening remarks for our event today. Without further ado, Dr. Asep, please open the session. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Ayu. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, especially to from Akihisa. Welcome to Indonesia Zoom. First of all, I'd like to thank for your presence here at Zoom meetings today. Today's webinar is the first launching CCHRS program. And on behalf of the Dean of Faculty of Social and Political Science, UPNVJ, let me say a few words. The Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta, or UPNVJ, has a vision to become an excellence university with international standard of innovative and competitive education and research. In line with that, the faculties of social science and political science also have the same vision and mission that supports. We are moving in that direction to contribute to the development of social political science and to improve the quality of learning for our students as well as research quality. We are incredibly pleased and proud to have some of our faculty members have the initiative to develop knowledge and expertise by initiating research centers such as the Center Citizenship and Human Rights Studies. The center was established to enrich the discourse and study of citizenship and human rights not only in the Indonesian context but also globally. It aims at becoming the leading study center in Indonesia in terms of research and capacity development on issues related to citizenship and the fulfillment of human rights. In Indonesia, these topics are still understudied, even though there have been some emerging scholars working on these issues. The centers would like to contribute to the development of such studies as part of the effort to strengthen the democracy and have an impact on the welfare of all citizens in Indonesia. To launch the center, and to have early conversation on the issues, we are organizing series of webinars on citizenship and democracy by reflecting and learning from Indonesia's and other countries' experience. Today's seminar is the first of 4 similar events to be held in the future. All sessions will be organized online through Zoom. The events are open for publics, but targeting scholars and students in Indonesia and abroad. All information will be provided in our website and social media, so please keep updates with our program. I would like to ask you to actively participate on this series. Wishing that you're going to have a wonderful discussion. I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you from Akihisa and Ms. Ayu.
Thank you very much. Terima kasih Pak Dr. Asep, our Vice Dean. Very warm welcome. Thank you. So I think we can start our discussion. So it is, I think the topics chosen for today's discussion is really important and what do you call that, relevant for today's situation worldwide, but especially the 2 countries that we will be mostly talking, elaborate in our discussion. Initially, I proposed to Professor Akihisa Matsuno to talk about human rights. It's kind of like assessment of human rights in general sense in the 2 countries. But I think Aki has a better, much better ideas on focusing on the one area of it, which is the freedom of expression in Japan and in Indonesia. As perhaps many of you also familiar with the situation, also with the current development here in Indonesia, I think this is a timely topics to be discussed and also to kick off our programs with the center. As Pak Asep, Dr. Asep, our Vice Dean mentioned, we will have series of webinars, seminars to officially launch our center, and there will be a lot more coming for our programs because we're planning also to do some research and some other programs that very much related to the topics. So I'm going to read, before I allow, I let Professor Akihisa Matsuno to start his talk. I will introduce him to all of you. I'm pretty sure that most of you already know Pak Akihisa, but let me just read his short bio. Uh, Professor Akihisa Matsuno is a professor in international politics at the Osaka School of International Public Policy, Osaka University. He obtained his MA at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies in 1982 and specializes in conflict studies with a focus on democratic governance and human rights, and has extensively written on conflicts in East Timor and Indonesia. His recent interest extends to other areas in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Africa. He was a research advisor to the Commission of Reception, Truth, and Reconciliation, or we are familiar with CRVR, in Timor-Leste in 2003 to 2004. He was chair of the Japan NGO Network on Indonesia, or JANI, JANNI, from 1998 to 2012. His English publications include The 30th Movement and its aftermath in Bali, October-December 1965. This is a chapter in a book edited by Catherine McGregor on the Indonesian genocide of 1965, published in 2018. Also, a publication on West Papua and the changing nature of self-determination, and the UN Transitional Administration and Democracy in Timor-Leste, ethnic groups' rights to independence, self-determination, secession, and post-conflict, post-Cold War international relations. This is chapters in some book publications and journals. All right, so with that very brief introduction of who Pak Akihisa is, I will then invite Professor Akihisa Matsuno to start the event and to share us the talk. Pak Aki?
Thank you, Ayu, for a nice introduction. My name is Akihisa Matsuno. I'm teaching at Osaka University. I'm teaching international politics for many years. And I've been doing research not only in Indonesia, East Timor, but also I'm now traveling a lot to other areas in Southeast Asia, Thailand, the Philippines, and the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, and Africa, Europe, and even Latin America, Argentina, and so on. So I'm basically visiting conflict areas and studying about, conflicts, but including dictatorship periods. So I feel very honored to have been invited to this kickoff event of the Center for Citizenship and Human Rights. I first of all, I want to say congratulations to Ayu and Professor Kamaluddin, Dean, Vice Dean, for opening this very nice center and a very good initiative in this age. Last year, 2020, we witnessed many events all over the world in relation with the citizenship and human rights. We saw what happened in the United States. You know, where it was an incredible development toward the end of the Trump period. You know, so it's a democratic country, the United States, but we witnessed how it works and how it didn't work. So we got many lessons from the experiences of the American people. Finally, in January, we got some sense of relief when Joe Biden was inaugurated as a new president. So, but we still have to see what will happen in the U.S. And we also witnessed what happened in Hong Kong. You know, it's a very serious situation in Hong Kong we are witnessing, and it seems China China's growing power, political power, economic power is, in my terminology, spilling over to other areas in Asia, well, including Japan. Japan is not exception. Historically, Japan was under very heavy pressure from China all the time, since the ancient times, through the Middle Age to the modern times. China was always at the doorstep of Japan. So we are very much influenced by what China does. So now we are looking at what China will do next. And then yesterday, Myanmar, what happened in Myanmar is really concerning. I'm very happy that Indonesia already released a statement, some accusatory tone about what happened in Myanmar. I think it is reasonable, because Indonesia also had authoritative regime before, and now it's a democratic, at least. Then I think Indonesia can take the initiative to accommodate Myanmar once again in the democratic communities of Southeast Asia. In Russia, yes, of course, it's very concerning, and in Europe, there are also events. So I think it is very timely that the Universitas Pembangunan, the UPN Veteran Jakarta, opened up the Center for Citizenship and Human Rights. But this is not only limited to Indonesia, but it has a global meaning. So I hope the IU and the center, the university, takes the initiative that is meaningful, not only for Indonesia, but for Asia and for the world. So my topic today, freedom of expression. Maybe I will talk about 40 minutes or so, but initially I planned to talk about 16 minutes. So I wrote 11 pages of speech, but it's on the chat area now. You can download it, so you can read it later on. But I have to confine my speech to 40 minutes or so that we can have more time for discussion. Even I planned to talk about this topic for 60 minutes. I thought 60 minutes is not enough to to comprehensively cover the issue both in Indonesia and Japan. But Indonesia is such a huge country, and Japan also has many problems. So I thought I could limit my talk to Japan only. And it's not that I don't know Indonesia. I know Indonesia rather well, but I think you can listen to my talk, bearing in mind the issues you have in your mind, so that you can apply my talk to the Indonesian cases. Okay, I want to share the screen. So wait a minute. Okay, well, this is the title of my presentation today. So freedom of expression. When we discuss freedom of expression, we usually do so in our respective context. United States, Europe, Japan, China, Malaysia, Indonesia. We live in different societies, different histories, different political, social, cultural, and religious backgrounds. Moreover, even in one society, people live with different ideas about how we must live as human beings. So what we can say publicly and what we cannot say, determined by these factors. In Indonesia especially, ethics of speech and speech manners also come forward in debates. To what extent certain expressions are tolerated. But this is particularly Asian phenomena, I guess. In Europe and United States, people can be more rude. You can say whatever you want. But in Asia, sometimes even discussing the public affairs, policies and politicians, we have to be very careful not to offend the other persons. But this is particularly Asian manner etiquette issue. And the freedom of expression is not an easy topic there. So it's very complex. So that's why I want to limit my talk to Japan today. And then in later on, maybe we can develop to the Indonesian cases. So I want to divide the talk into 3 parts. First, I talk about phenomena that are important in debates over freedom of expression so that you can know what's going on in Japan, at least a little bit. But second, I discuss general principles of freedom of expression. Third, I summarize my talk. My position in this debate over freedom of expression is that of political science. I'm not a legal expert. But freedom of expression, when we come to concrete disputes, must be dealt with legally. But freedom of expression is also an essential item in the broader philosophy of democracy. With the approach of political philosophy in mind, I look at freedom of expression more as a tool that is necessary for the maintenance of a modern democratic nation state, rather than a manifestation of our time-honored convictions, beliefs, or emotions. In short, I look at freedom of expression as a political arrangement or institution. It's still a philosophy, of course, but it is a practical philosophy. It is the spirit of pragmatism that guides my thoughts in discussing freedom of expression. Freedom of expression has been discussed as a political pragmatism by many scholars. Here, I just want to mention Professor Michael Walzer. He wrote a book on toleration, as you can see in the screen on the left side. He wrote it in 1994. So it was just after the collapse of the Cold War, and it was much, much before the 9/11. So it was a period where the spirit of tolerance was most strongly felt. So he writes about toleration, not tolerance, as a political institution that binds active members of a society. But the difference is important. Toleration and tolerance. Tolerance is a state of mind, or ability or capacity to tolerate something. You forgive. It's a mental condition that you are ready to forgive. But toleration is an act of tolerating something. So it's an act to actually forgive, even though you don't forgive in your mind, you do it publicly. It's an act. So it's a political act. So maybe you don't like a certain opinion, maybe you don't agree to it, but you understand that others have different ideas from yours, and therefore you in principle allow them to exist, just like you want your ideas to be allowed to exist. So if you want to exist, you have to allow other persons to exist on an equal footing, equally. So it's a mutual recognition of existence. So toleration is necessary in this case. If members of our societies are equal, our different ideas in principle have equal weight. Okay, but that's the initial statement of my position, and then we go into some episodes. First, I talk about phenomena that draw attention in Japan in relation with the freedom of expression. Well, in present-day Japan, 2 issues are most debated. One is freedom of the press, and the other is hate speech. The freedom of the press. Freedom of the press in Japan used to rank very high in the past, but the rank has drastically declined recently. But you can see this declining trend in the annual ranking of the Press Freedom Index by the Reporters Without Borders. But this is a graph. The Reporters Without Borders is an NGO, but its reputation is established. So many newspapers and media cover when the indexes appear, when index is released, all the Japanese newspapers rush to the result, and they report on the disappointing result always now. So the Reporters Without Borders is now nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. So let's see. As you can see from the graph, Japan ranked 26 in 2002 when the index started. It rose to 11th in out of 180 countries. You know, Japan rose once to 11th. It's very high in 2010, and it dropped sharply to 53rd in 2013. The reason of this drop is the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The government was accused of concealing the information on the leak of radiation and for blocking access by journalists and citizens to crucial information. So this behavior of the government was considered by the NGO, and the ranking dropped sharply. In the next decade, the once fallen ranking did not recover. Instead, the downward trend became a clear pattern under the Abe Shinzo administration, which started in 2012 and ended in 2020, only last year. The one NGO is now saying this is a crisis for freedom of opinion expression in Japan. So now we are facing a crisis. And this NGO is a coalition of many human rights organizations which submitted a counter report to the Human Rights Committee of the UN. What kind of episodes we have in Japan to show the recent worrying trend? One is the NHK. I want to start with the case of political interference in the NHK's TV program on so-called comfort women in 2001. The case, this was a big scandal, and many books were published after this, and some NHK staff resigned from the position. And the Asahi Shimbun newspaper writer who wrote about this was now transferred to a remote area. So it was very scandalous. It affected many people. The case needs a lot of explanation. Japan's public NHK is a public broadcasting corporation. It's not a state television. It's a public corporation separate from the state, like BBC. But it collects money from the viewers. But the viewers are obliged to pay by law. So it's not a private. So it's a public, but it's not a state television like Indonesian state television. But it's like BBC. It's a public, somewhere between the state and the society. But it's supposed to be independent as a media, but the public, the nature is public. So that's why the government sometimes want to intervene. The NHK wanted to make a documentary on a historic big energy event held in Tokyo in December 2000. The event was the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, which was a 5-day mock tribunal to reveal the truth of wartime sexual slavery of the Japanese military in Asia-Pacific area. Indonesian audience, maybe you know this by the term of Jugun Ianfu. The Japanese military took women for facilities called comfort stations or brothels and forced them to serve many soldiers sexually. It is also called a military sexual slavery system in human rights terminology. So the victims of Korea, China, Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, and East Timor came to Japan to testify at the tribunal. Because it is a mock tribunal, the verdict is not binding, of course. It's not a legal judicial event. The tribunal found the Japanese emperor and the military and the civilian leaders at the time guilty for the sexual slavery. So NHK made a documentary on this event and broadcast it on 30 January 2001. But many were surprised, including me, because I was also cooperating with this program. We're surprised because the program was very strange in many points. First, The documentary did not mention, sorry, the documentary did not mention the title of the event, the tribunal, nor the organizer of the event, and it did not mention keywords such as Japanese military or sexual slavery. So it's very unclear what this program was talking about. Who is doing what? You know, it's so unclear. It did not show scenes of the tribal, nor used any part of the organizers' interviews. So none of the Japanese soldiers' testimonies were used, but Japanese soldiers' testimonies were important because they were on the perpetrated side, you know, not the victim side. So it's very important. It did not pick up positive comments by experts. And most importantly, the program did not mention any part of the verdict. Instead, the documentary used a lengthy interview of an expert who was famous for standing on the denialist side. But there are many scholars who deny the comfort women issue. But they say they were just prostitutes, they were just commercial women, so there was no coercion, there was no force. So it's incredible that they demand compensation and justice. The tribunal was held exactly to counter-argue this type of denialist discourse, but the program looked as if NHK was criticizing the event. So in short, the documentary, as a result, was very far away from what the organizer expected. Because the NHK had to cut many parts on the eve of the broadcast in one day, the total time of the documentary was cut 4 minutes, from the normal 44 minutes to 40 minutes. But this is unusual. It is true that the Broadcast Corporation has a final say on editing, but the organizer fully cooperated with NHK in making the program, so they felt they were betrayed by NHK. So why did this happen? Why did NHK make changes to the program at the very last moment? One is political interference. The names of at least 2 politicians emerged at the time. Mr. Shinzo Abe, but later Prime Minister, you know, but he was a Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary at the time, still young. So Mr. Shinzo Abe from the government, he told the newspaper that he told NHK to be neutral and fair. And there was another politician from the ruling party. So some days before the broadcast, on 26 January, 4 or 5 days before the program was aired, staff of NHK's management visited members of the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, and they were asked to explain the documentary on the Women's Tribunal. On 29 January, 1 day before the program was aired, a very high-level NHK official visited Mr. Abe, who said that NHK must make programs from a fair and a neutral viewpoint, but this is a pressure. The next day was the day of the broadcasting the programs. Now only 1 day was left for NHK to make any alterations to the contents of the program. So now we come to the NHK's self-censorship. We can ask why NHK could not ignore political interference like this. What Mr. Abe said was simply the NHK must be neutral and fair. Yeah, that's of course, you know, all kinds of mass media reports, basically, in principle, must be fair and must be impartial. That's what we expect from the public mass media. So NHK denies that it edited the contents of the program because of the pressures by outside forces. But from the course of the events, it is very obvious that the final alterations were made hastily without enough time to fill the final 4 minutes of the time frame. If the editing had been done much before, this kind of strange result would have been avoided. So you would probably ask, why, first of all, does NHK bother visiting politicians and listening to their views about particular program? You may think this is a suicide for the mass media, but certainly politicians would complain about programs or casters from their own criteria, but that they can do so. Moreover, NHK staff visited politicians of the ruling party only. They never visit politicians of the opposition. This hearing from the ruling party politicians occurs only to NHK and not to other private broadcasters, because NHK is a public broadcast, and they want to communicate with the ruling party politicians so that their activities are recognized, and more importantly, their budget. The budget must be approved by the Diet. So the budget does not come from the government. It's not a state budget. The money is collected from those who have a television. So if you have one television set, you have to pay a certain amount of money to NHK. This is binding by law. But there are many people in Japan, maybe 20%, 25% of the viewers don't pay because there's no sanction. But this is determined by law. If you have one television set, you have to pay, $200, $300 per year. And if you have two television sets, you have to pay double. But you can imagine one hotel has 100 television sets and how much they have to pay. So the budget of the NHK must be approved by the parliament. So that's why they contact parliamentarians. The period of the budget approval is between February and March. It is therefore a common practice that NHK staff of the management visit ruling party politicians in late January so that the budget for the next fiscal year will pass the Diet without problem. But here is a danger as a media. Because of this budget approval system, NHK cannot confront criticism from the government, the ruling party, or ruling party politicians. Unlike print media like newspapers, broadcast companies, including NHK, cannot refuse political interference because of Article 4 of the Broadcast Act. This is a legal basis that makes political interference possible. But there is no such law for print media, so newspapers are rather free from government intervention like this. But Article 4 obliges broadcasters, 1, not to harm public security nor public morals, to maintain public fairness, political fairness. Number 3, not to distort the facts in news reporting. And 4, in dealing with the issues with disagreements. In this case, exactly, the comfort women issue is a controversy. So the broadcasters must clarify the issues from as many angles as possible. You cannot make a documentary based on a one-sided view. But this is law. So the government can complain about this. The Broadcast Act has been criticized at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. That during the Universal Periodic Review of Japan in 2018, the United States recommended to repeal Article 4 of the Broadcast Act, and Austria from Europe to remove legal basis for undue government interference, referring to this Article 4. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression came to Japan in 2017, and he wrote in his mission report that the non-independent government agencies should not be in the position of determining what is fair. In this case, the government is in a position to determine what is fair and what is not fair, and recommended the Japanese government repeal Article 4 of the Broadcast Act. If a broadcaster television violates Article 4, their license can be revoked. Article 174 of the Act gives power to the Minister of Internal Affairs and Communications to suspend a license when a broadcaster violates provisions of this law or disobey orders or measures issued based on the law. So these articles make broadcasters particularly vulnerable to complaints from politicians. So after this scandal, the NHK directors who are involved in the program either resigned or were transferred to less influential posts. And a newspaper staff writer who wrote an article about the NHK's re-editing program was transferred to a faraway post. So it affected the lives of many journalists after this. Well, politicians said that they have not pressured NHK, but they only said what was expected to the broadcaster from the Broadcast Act. The NHK says that it re-edited the program voluntarily, not because of external pressures. But it is also true that the result was a very strange program, and the phenomenon as a whole reveals that the freedom of the press in Japan is shamefully fragile. Okay, I think I go on the second case. Maybe I skip some episodes later on, but I want to go to the second case, hate speech. The second issue in relation to freedom of press, freedom of expression in Japan is hate speech. But hate speech popped up as a rather sensational issue around 2007. When an ultra-right group, Zaitoku-kai, began activities, and its sensation continued until 2015, when the legislation on hate speech passed the Diet. It wasn't the end of xenophobia, but at least outright public expression of hatred against the Koreans became a too risky action to do. What is Zaitoku-kai? The full name of the group is a Citizens Association not to permit the privileges of the resident foreigners in Japan. Well, as usual, the Japanese organizations' names are very long. The resident foreigners mean Korean residents with a special permanent resident status. But this has a historical reason. The number of such Korean residents is estimated to be around 700,000 in Japan now, and constitute more than half of all foreign residents with a permanent resident status in Japan. The faces of Koreans look exactly the same as us, Japanese, so we cannot distinguish, even I cannot distinguish between Koreans and Japanese. So maybe people don't know exactly what's happening, but but Koreans are discriminated against in many respects in Japan a long time. But they are descendants of the Koreans who lost their Japanese nationality after the war ended and could not go back to Korea. When Japan was defeated in 1945, Korea became free from Japanese domination. These Koreans were suddenly deprived of their Japanese nationality. They used to be Japanese nationals. When Japan colonized or dominated Korean Peninsula, we made them Japanese citizens as well, but slightly different status. But they both are Japanese. That's why they were mobilized into war in Southeast Asia. So many Koreans actually went to Indonesia as Japanese soldiers. And they were engaged in atrocities, and they were tried after the war, and they were convicted, and some of them executed as Japanese, but in fact, they were Koreans. For various reasons, many of them could not go back to Korea. In 1991, Japan established a law to give them a special permanent resident status. But since then, they can continue to live in Japan, but they have no right to vote, no right to participate in elections. Basically, they are still foreigners, even though many of them are born in Japan, educated in Japanese schools, and pay taxes just like Japanese. But younger generations are often more fluent in Japanese than in Korean. So this Zaitoku-kai, this organization, they organize numerous rallies in Tokyo and Osaka. Tokyo and Osaka have Koreatown, just like Chinatowns. They are now popular tourist spots with many Korean restaurants and shops. The rallies walk in these districts while shouting, insulting, or threatening slogans like "You Koreans go back to Korea," "You Koreans, you are cockroaches," "You Koreans, you what's that? You are dirty. You go back to Korea, otherwise we will kill you. But this kind of threatening slogans is uttered in the demonstrations. The most famous incident occurred at a Korean school in Kyoto. The second one, Korean school in Kyoto. The school had a problem. They were using a nearby small park as its own ground because they were not permitted to buy lands. But the school, for this illegal use of the park, for many years, the school had to pay some $1,000. It's a small money anyway. But the Zaitokukai, this organization, took up this issue and organized rallies in front of the school, shouting dirty slogans. Because their slogans were so loud and threatening and disturbing the classes, the students began to cry because of fear. The police did not stop. So it is understandable that Koreans felt that they were not protected in the Japanese society. After the incident, 4 members of the Zaitokukai group were prosecuted and were sentenced to 1 or 2 years with probation. But separately from the criminal process, the Korean school filed a suit against the group and won a compensation of more than 10 million yen. So Zaitokukai argued what they shouted were political expressions. So they must be allowed to say political things because we have freedom of expression. They said it's not hate speech. But the courts did not accept such a claim. So why Koreans? Why Koreans are so hated in Japan? Well, attacking Koreans physically and verbally and discriminating Koreans have roots in Japan's modern history. Before Japan modernized itself in the 19th century as a nation, as a nation state, the feudal Japan had offshore diplomatic relations with only 2 foreign countries, that is, Korea and the Kingdom of Ryukyu, or present-day Okinawa. But these are the only 2 countries we had diplomatic relations with. We never had diplomatic relations with the United States. We didn't have any diplomatic relations with Britain, France, Germany, but with Netherlands, we had trade relations through Nagasaki, but that was a trade relations. It's not authorized official diplomatic relations. We had trade relations with China and the Netherlands, but these were not regarded as state-to-state relations, but as relations based on private commercial activities. Well, so Korea was a respected country at the time, but as Japanese imperial ambitions grew larger after the modernization, Japan began to see Korea as a potential territory to annex as a buffer with Russia and China. So Korea is located between China, Russia, and Japan. Who will get it? Japan did not want China or Russia to get it. So that's why Japan wanted to get it. Japan obtained Taiwan in 1895 after the Sino-Japan War, the first colony of Japan, and annexed Korea in 1910 after the former Japanese prime minister and governor for Korea was assassinated by a Korean pro-independence activist. So naturally, nationalist movements emerged in Korea, and they fought against Japanese colonialism, calling for the restoration of independence. The first massacre of Koreans occurred in Tokyo. Sorry, I have to move to this assassination, right? The first massacre of Koreans occurred in Tokyo in 1923, when Tokyo was hit by a huge earthquake. The victims in Tokyo were about 100,000. So 100,000 people died because of the earthquake. Well, in fact, mostly because of the fire. And the capital city, Tokyo, was totally devastated. So against this background, there was a rumor which originated in a notification from the police department that Koreans were conspiring to bring about chaos to Japan. The exact number of Korean victims is not known, but it is estimated to be a few thousand. But Chinese were also targeted. So because capital Japan was devastated by the earthquake and many people died, and the government, well, it was not functioning properly, so very chaotic. So there was a rumor, initially fed by the police department, the Koreans are conspiring to topple down the Japanese government to get independence. So the people became vigilant organizations. People organized themselves vigilant and then began to attack Koreans on the streets indiscriminately. And then they killed thousands of Koreans on the streets. So the anti-Korea sentiments of Japanese come from their dislike of political demands of Koreans. But Japanese think, very wrongly of course, Koreans demand too much. They demanded independence. Yes, that's of course, you know. They demanded compensation for atrocities. They demanded justice of the colonial period. Well, for Koreans, but these are nothing more than the legitimate demands, but they are not understood in Japan. Well, let's come back to the hate speech. The Diet passed the hate speech elimination law in 2016. The official name of the law is the Act on the Promotion of Efforts to Eliminate Unfair Discriminatory Speech and Behavior Against the Persons Originating Outside Japan. Again, this is a very long name. As the name indicates, the law does not regulate nor punish hate speech. It does not cover hate speech against the domestic minorities, such as Ainu people, Okinawans, or Black people. Only foreigners. Rather, the law obliges the national and local governments to make efforts to eliminate hate speech. So after all, hate speech is not a criminal offense yet in Japan, but the law is evidently weak when compared with those in Europe. But since then, publicly expressed hate speech against Koreans has decreased. So the legislation had some effects, but the discrimination still exists, and the sporadic racist statements continue to this day. So now I have to I have to rush to end my talk. So after learning some episodes in Japan, I think it's time to discuss about principles of freedom of expression. Now we understand there are two different aspects of freedom of expression: freedom to be protected and freedom to be restricted. So we say that press freedom and academic freedom must be protected at the maximum level. On the other hand, we deny freedom for hate speech. So hate speech must be prohibited. So what is common criteria in promoting press freedom, academic freedom is a public interest. Press freedom and academic freedom are necessary for public interest. But racist speech is not. You don't need racist speech for democracy to function. Public interest in a democratic society is a basic notion to sustain democracy and make democratic institutions function properly. Democratic institutions here include all public offices of the government, the legislature, the judiciary, and others. In concrete terms, press freedom and academic freedom are necessary for journalists and academics to carry out their professional duty in a democratic society, the duty to inform the public of facts, views, and opinions. People have the right to know about the works of state institutions and those in public office. Journalists have a special duty to represent people in that aspect. People must be allowed to discuss policies freely. Policies are subject to constant discussion. If you allow only positive comments and forbid negative comments, as many governments and politicians want to do, it is not not only unfair, but also harmful for a proper functioning of democracy. Well, I come to the conclusion suddenly. I think I have no time to continue anymore. So I want to conclude.
Sorry, Pa, I think you still have like 7 or 8 more minutes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
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 Because
Okay.
we started a bit late. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you remember I talked about toleration at the beginning by Michael Walzer. You know, why is toleration necessary in our society? Tolerance is a state of mind. We cannot control what you think, but we can agree on how you act. You know, but this is a modern modern concept. So we regulate what we do, not what we think. We cannot control what you think, but we control what we do. So toleration is necessary, but this concerns the very basic idea of a modern nation state. A modern nation state, Indonesia, Japan, both, is not based on ethnicity or religion. Every society has its own ethnic composition and religious majority and minorities, but that is a fact. But we might recall the American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points in 1918. If you're a student of international relations, you know that. But if you're not, this Woodrow Wilson, American president, declared 14 points at toward the end of the First World War. He presented a vision after the war, how the world must be organized. It was a historic statement about self-determination of peoples. And in fact, it led to the birth of a number of new nations in Central and Eastern Europe, or more commonly called the Balkan area, after World War I. He proposed to think of nations along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. But this is very important. Along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. But this is the base of nation. I think this passage is extremely important. A modern nation state is defined as a nation with historically established allegiance and nationality and nothing else. But it is not necessarily ethnicity, race, or religion. So in short, any type of consensus can become the base of a nation as far as people agree. I think in Indonesian case, as I learned Indonesian history in my university days from my Japanese teacher, but Indonesia was such a diverse society, and the only one thing you agreed on was the unity of Indonesia, the unity of people, nothing else. And so under this unity, the Panchashila is of course something people agreed on. And we agreed on this on the nation of Indonesia, and not really based on the ethnicity, race, or religion, but to be united, you agreed on. So modern nation state, therefore, by nature is diverse, just like Indonesia is. But it's diverse in ethnicity, race, and religion. Now, toleration is naturally a necessary virtue. And to make toleration work properly, freedom of expression is a pragmatic necessity. So here, my idea, my point is, freedom of expression is pragmatic necessity. It's not a morality. It's not a moral conviction you believe. But yes, some people believe if you are a liberal person, you have beliefs and liberal ideas such as freedom. But in my point of view, freedom of expression is necessary pragmatically to make democracy function in diverse society. So I wrote about defamation issue, but this is maybe relevant in Indonesia, but there's no more time. Okay, let me go quickly. Defamation. Defamation is a persistent issue in countries like Indonesia. In Japan, defamation rarely becomes a hot topic. The Penal Code of Japan defines defamation. So we have defamation in the Penal Code as a criminal offense in its Article 230. But it makes a criminal offense to defame a person alleging facts in public, regardless of whether such facts are true or false. But if defamation is related to matters of public interest, you mean defame public servants, presidents, vice president, prime minister, or whatever, it's a totally different story. If defamation is related to matters of public interest or to have been conducted solely for the benefit of the public, there is no, if it has proved to be true, there is no punishment. So as far as you present truth and facts, even though you defame your political leaders, there is no punishment. But that's the law in Japan. The similar rule applies to allegation against public officers, candidates for elections. From this penal code, we understand that you can criticize public servants and persons with some public offices, including your political leaders, without being punished, as far as your criticism is true, or criticism can be believed to be true. The stipulation effectively prevents governments from using the penal code to deal with defamatory criticism. So that's why we don't have defamation cases from the government in Japan. But insult is a different category. Insult is also stipulated by Article 231 by Penal Code. But it seems I don't know any recent cases of insult. So it seems very close to defamation. The government is so much reluctant to use this defamation and insult as an attack on individual critics. But defamation can be a civil case, and we have lots of cases. So I want to skip the cases. So finally, we come to the conclusion, a reflection. The freedom of expression has two dimensions. It must be protected when speech is about matters with public interest, typically about persons with some public office or public policies. Freedom of expression must be restricted when speech is about matters related with inseparable attributes of individuals or group, such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. Hate speech is a typical case of the latter. We should not get confused about these two different dimensions of freedom of expression. The differences are clear enough. A modern nation state is by nature diverse, but diversity is a natural feature of a modern state. And in fact, it is a source of strength to maintain healthy diversity that contribute to enhancement of public interest. We have to both promote and restrict freedom of expression. So whether we want or not, we already live in the modern age and the age of globalization. So diversity is unavoidable. So we have to live side by side with people with diverse backgrounds and diverse political views, domestically and globally. Freedom of expression should be located within the context of this global society, which is essentially diverse now. Okay, so I want to finish my presentation here. Thank you very much for listening patiently.
Thank you so much, Professor Matsuno. There's really a lot of things to be taken there and to be thought of, and I'm pretty sure that for next we're going to the discussion, question and answer. I'm sure there will be a lot of thoughts and ideas and comments from the audience. Two things I think I can underline, learning from the experience of Japan, and you reflect a bit on Indonesian situation. But I think you made a very right point to say that freedom of and academic freedom, freedom of expression must be protected at the maximum level, and that freedom of expression is a pragmatic necessary. And secondly, also underlining that toleration is necessary virtue, because at what you said at the last part, because diversity is unavoidable. And I think from the audience, I can tell that coming from many countries that also might want to share or reflects on their own context. So I will open for Q&A. Please, maybe perhaps for the first 2 or 3 comments or questions. Anyone from the audience? Oh, Alvin. Alvin is from Korea, North
Yes,
Korea.
ma'am.
Alvin is, well, you should introduce yourself, Alvin. Please,
Okay.
for the audience, please introduce yourself, names and affiliations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bayu, for the opportunity and also the information about this great event this evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Professor Aki. My name is Alvin. Actually, I'm a former student of Bayu almost a decade ago at Indonesia. And currently, I'm a graduate student at Seoul National University at Seoul, majoring in international cooperation at GSIS. And also currently, I'm acted as an assistant news editor at KBS for the Indonesian radio. So yeah, what happened at NHK, maybe I can share my insight and my experience for at least a year and a half working and studying in Korea. Maybe what happened in NHK is not really occurred for us for working in KBS. So, but maybe NHK situation is experienced also by some college at the Voice of America, which is just like at the last month. Yeah, last month, the Indonesian correspondent at the White House, the Miss Patsy, Mbak Patsy Widakuswara, is just almost being revamped by the government of the USA after chasing the Secretary Pompeo at the VOA headquarters. And also the Secretary Pompeo also criticizing VOA about their latest coverage about the American government. Just like Secretary Pompeo said that VOA is not longer the voice of America, but it's the vice of America, which is there's also another vice media outlet existing right now. But we can see also the experience from maybe the RT in Russia, which is the Russia Today, or maybe the TRT in Turkey, which is it's really just like the government public relation, quote unquote, for their government. And then my question is, in the Japan's situation, also maybe in Indonesian situation with TVRI, is it still necessary to becoming for me it's neutral, is it's a quite ambivalent and a quite ambiguous. For me it's just like being impartial, but sometimes during these times of era when the social media information and news is really scattered around, that's really challenging for us the journalists. I think government is also need a media outlet to share at least the government views and so on, which is I also did that in KBS. So far KBS also for me it's trying to be really impartial. Even when we are covering about the North Korea, we are never mock Kim Jong-un in the public. So it's really polite when we are just like relaying the news from the North Korea media outlet. So my question for Professor Aki is, in the future, should we still rely the information from the government-owned outlet, which is from the Reuters news report? It's published in 2020. In Japan, the most trusted media, it's still NHK, which is around 40%. So the future, what will be the role of the government-owned media enterprises? Thank you.
Pak Aki, if it's okay, we'll take another 2 of the questions before you can respond. Okay. Second question or comments, anyone? No? All right, so perhaps only one for now. Please, Taki.
Thank you for a very good question, Alvin. So you have some experiences, so your question is very focused and directed to your point. So about neutrality, I use the word neutrality not as a term in the law, not as a term of my own. It is the term that Abe Shinzo used. So he used NHK must be neutral and fair, but nobody is saying that. The law, a broadcast law, broadcast act in this case, it is saying that then the reporting, news reporting must be fair. Okay, it's very close to impartial, not neutral. So neutrality is not a condition for the news reporting in this case. The only Mr. Shinzo Abe is saying that. So I think people are pretty much clearly aware that the difference between the impartiality and neutrality, especially those working in the world of knowledge like us and the journalists, you know. Well, we should be impartial to a certain extent, but we don't have to be neutral. You know. So we can be on the side of one or two, and if you think that is right. So what we do is to choose the right thing. So the mass media have to be try to be impartial, but not to be neutral, I think. And the Broadcast Act doesn't assume that the broadcasters must be neutral. So they should be fair and they should be impartial, but not equal. And the government, the government's position, well, the I don't know. Well, I think the NHK, the style of the mode of existence of broadcasting corporation like NHK is okay. It's good. You know, it's not a state television, but it's not a private television. So it's a public television, while assumingly supported by the whole nation, and we have to pay some money to support it. And it's a privileged position, you know, like BBC. It doesn't have to take advertisements. So we see NHK without advertisements. Very, very, very nice to see, you know. And the NHK. So the problem is the NHK's budget must be approved by the diet. It's not by the government, but the diet is of course controlled by the ruling party. The ruling party is basically the government. So indirectly, the NHK's budget and according to the contents of the budget, contents of the programs can be theoretically controlled by the government. But that is a line connecting the NHK and the government, which we think is really problematic. So we want NHK law. It's an independent legal thing. NHK law to guarantee the 100% independence of NHK from the government. The NHK, the top of NHK is appointed by the government, but that is also a problem. And for the budget approval procedure, so NHK executive staffs must come to ruling party politicians for approval. They are not supposed to talk about to specific programs. You know, they are not supposed to be intervening in a specific program, but they can discuss about general general principles and guidelines and the policies of NHK. But of course, they do. You know, say, oh, I don't like this program. I don't like this caster, you know. I want some more neutrality and something. But this is a pressure, clearly, and NHK cannot neglect. So this kind of contact between the politicians and NHK must stop, I think. Yeah, so there is a problem at the legal level, and there's a problem at this, it's practical level, practice level. I think many things must improve, but overall, I still think the mode of existence of a broadcasting corporation like NHK is good. It's public, but not state, but not private. I think so.
Okay, thank you, Pak. Anyone? I heard Rachel De Silva wanted to talk, or
but there are questions on chat.
There is a question from Danilo Cortez. Who should watch the watchdog, the media as societal institution? Where can the society draw the line to ensure that freedom of expression will not be abused or misused to legitimize propaganda, news, or spin false narratives?
Yeah. Well, in Japan, there is a Council of Mass Media, something like that, which is a coalition of many mass media companies, including newspapers and broadcasts and so on. But this Council of Mass Media is a forum to receive complaints from anybody, from individuals, from journalists themselves, from politicians if they like, they can. So this council receive complaints from everybody, and they discuss and they judge. They come to a conclusion, and they declare that this was wrong, that was wrong. So it's a voluntary organization among the mass media companies to monitor the functioning of the mass media. So I think that is functioning very well. Many countries like the US and the European countries have a similar organization, but this is separate from the government. The government should refrain from intervening in the mass media, but that is the basic principle and conception, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Pak. Anyone else want to ask question or comments?
Can I have a comment?
Yes, sure.
Is it okay if I speak in English, in Indonesian?
Semi. Pak Aki, ini Semi Gultom. Sam, I think it's okay. Do you mind, Pak Aki?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Do you have translator, or if not, then I can speak in English?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
whatever that is convenient to you. I mean,
English,
if yes, okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Aki, for the presentations, and I think you share a very important issue that we are not only in Indonesia, but I think also worldwide. We are now experiencing this phenomena, but I think I maybe not completely agree with you regarding the media, because in my opinion, you have portrayed media, especially the major media, as if they are an institutions that really taking care of freedom of expressions or the public interest and so on and so forth. While we know that the case is not like that. And I think too many, so many studies already showed that major media, they're just in the same how to say it, like in the same car with the ruling elites. Just look at the study from, for example, Noam Chomsky about the manufacturing consent. So the media, especially the major media, it's exactly the institutions that somehow deteriorate the freedom of expressions rather than promoting freedom of expressions. And I think this is one of the biggest challenge now, because I think the previous question is correctly, I think correctly raised about who should watch the media, especially the major media. Look at, for example, the last election in the US. look how the media they almost didn't say anything about Joe Biden in the past, as if he was a new person coming for election, as if he didn't have any contributions about what happened in the Middle East and also in the Ukraine and etc. So I think we have to be very careful when we presume media as a promoter of freedom of expressions. Especially I'm talking about the major media. Now, I think also it's important that the civil society organizations or the pro-democratic movements really confronting this issue. I remember that 5 or 6 years ago, one of my students writing a thesis about this, about the media, and he also questions or interviewed the journalists. And you know, in Indonesia, the major media belongs to the political elites who are now in power, and the journalists more or less the same. They don't really care about freedom of expression, impartiality, and so on and so forth. Because this is a profit-making institutions, so they're only selling news, and they have nothing to do with what you said as tools of democracy and so on and so forth. So I think it's very, I understand that the major media plays an important role, but it is completely, for me, it's completely wrong to assume that they are the promoter, essentially the promoter of freedom of expressions. In fact, the case now worldwide, it's part of the problem. And I more, actually, I would like to hear more from you about the role of other kind of media, alternative media, including WikiLeaks. We are now relying on Wikipedia, WikiLeaks, and other social media. I know that social media also not inherently impartial and good, but you know that these are the alternatives that ordinary citizens can access diverse news, and sometimes it's more impartial than the major media, news from the major media. Thank you.
I think that's a very important point. Pak Aki?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question, and you have a very deep insight about how the media should work. And I fully agree, basically what you say about the situation of media companies in Indonesia and in Japan. In Japan we have a newspaper law. I cannot translate it properly, but we have a newspaper law, and this law it doesn't say anything about the content of the reporting, but it does say about the money, the shares, stock share, stock of company. So usually the this major mass media companies in Japan are not run by private persons. The stock must be shared among the journalists. For example, Asahi newspaper, but because it has a long history, it was established many years ago. So the journalists have a share, saham. The journalists have their own saham stocks, and so the journalists control the company, not by anybody else. So I think this kind of regulation is important, as to guarantee the source of money, source of funds for the mass media is controlled in a more proper way. You know, if it is totally thrown to the market, then of course a rich person can have their own mass media. You know? The rich person can run a newspaper. The rich businessman can run a broadcast television. That's that's contrary to the proper functioning of democracy. So we want mass media because it has a special public duty. You know? Mass media has a special public duty. So even though it is run by private companies, just like trains, just like buses, it must serve public interest. So this public interest must be controlled by law. As far as they are public companies. Of course, they have to seek profits. Yeah, that's of course. But at the same time, they have an aspect of public interest. As so that is different from just in a private company. So the companies with public interest must be regulated by law. And in this case, mass media, the saham, the stocks, must be shared principally by journalists themselves, so that the company does not depend on money from outside. Because the history of journalism in Indonesia is still young, you know, only after the independence. I think the state is very powerful, and the capitalism in Indonesia has grown so rapidly during the Suharto period, and so it's so powerful, and so these companies with the public interest did not have enough opportunity to grow, to develop. Not only newspapers, public transportation, for example, and other many private sectors with public interest, but they must have their own regulations. But this hasn't developed in Indonesia very well. That is one point I observe in Indonesian modern history. I think in that sense, Japan had a longer history, a little bit longer than Indonesia, but still shorter than Europe. So the Europe is a model in this case, you know. So they developed very much. They developed the private sector, but with public interest. So the public aspect of the public interest is regulated by law. So I think it's a difficult situation in Indonesia. I understand, but I still prefer market-oriented private mass media rather than state media. State media it's so dangerous from my own experience. So I still prefer, if we have to choose, you know, if we have to choose, I choose a market-oriented private media. But then you need regulation to control the flow of money, so that the journalists are not dependent on money from outside. So, and this also an code of ethics of journalists. You know, the journalists cannot receive money from interviewees, for example. Journalists can't receive money actually from anybody. Actually, they interview people, they interview politicians, they come to conferences to cover, you know, to make a report. But they should not report. They should not receive anything from these interviewees and the companies. But that code of ethics must be strictly followed by journalists, and this must be supervised by the companies, and the companies shouldn't be dependent on external money.
Thank you, Pak. There's a question from Johannes Kuahati. Johannes is a student from Universitas Nusa Cendana in Kupang. I'll read the question. Wouldn't it be dangerous if a media were just left free without any supervision, especially if negative opinions continue to develop? Of course, it will have an impact on domestic stability. What do you think about this statement?
I think this is similar to the case of bad products going to the market. Market is free, so many manufacturers produce products, commodities, and they put them into the market, and we consumers look around and we choose, and we don't know exactly, you know, what is good and what is bad. So we to respond to this kind of situation, I think we have to strengthen the market mechanisms, so that the consumers can select what is good news and what is bad news. And bad news must be gradually kicked out of the market because they don't sell very well. So we have to buy, as consumers, we have to buy good news, and we shouldn't buy bad news. But this is a market mechanism. So to empower a market like this, there must be interlocutors. There must be mediators. There must be mediators between the market and the producers, factories. And these mediators can say, oh, can say, well, this is good media, this is bad media. So it's a complex structure, but still, I think we need to maintain a free market of information. And in this free market of information, the consumers also must become clever. And how to become clever? The mediators between the manufacturers and the consumers can inform the public what is good and what is bad. And to coming generations, young people, students and pupils, we have a lot of opportunities to teach them how to select, how to choose. So this kind of education is also very important. So media literacy is one of the important items for next generations, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Akihisa Matsuno. It's 4:30 now at my time. I think we've come to the end. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our kickoff event today. And also especially thanks to Professor Akihisa Matsuno, who have prepared such a great and wonderful presentation for today. And we've already shared Professor's presentation in the chat, but if anyone hasn't got it, you can email us. It's the email. The host will write down the email. Yvette, could you please write down our email? So if you are interested in our future webinar series, we're hoping to do it next week. The invited resource person will be Dr. Ward Berenschot from KTL Leiden, but we will confirm further for that. So if you're interested to get updates from us, please just email us and we will keep you updated. Again, Professor Akihisa Matsuno, thank you so much for sharing with us. And I'm hoping in the future we can collaborate or we can invite you more and mengganggu in a very positive ways, of course.
Saya siap untuk diganggu.
Thank you so much, Pak Aki. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for the host for facilitating today's event. Hope for the best for you all, and sehat-sehat selalu. For the Indonesians means stay well and health for good wellness for all of us. Sehat-sehat terus ya.
Oke, terima kasih semuanya dan
thank you.
Selamat.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, okay. Sorry. If you want the certificate, because many Indonesians are still, consider certificates are important. So if you want to have certificate from today's event, please fill in the form. But also, if you don't wish to have the certificate, just also please fill in the form, because it's like a list of present. What do you call that? Absent. What do you call that, Pak, in English?
Well, absensi.
Attendance list. Yeah. Attendance list. You're much more Indonesian than me, Pak. All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.